Hello. I hope the weather is better where you are than it is here, where it's pouring rain and the wind is whipping around the house at 40 or 50 miles an hour. Let us hope the internet does not go out. Okay, Wordsworth's She Stoops to Conquer. As we turn now from Molière's Tartuffe to Goldsmith's play, we move forward 100 years, from the mid-17th century to the mid-18th, and we move from France back again to England. We also shift from a corrosive satire meant to expose moral corruption to, with Goldsmith, a gentler satire that is more a comedy of manners than an ethical indictment like Tartuffe. First produced for the London stage in 1773, She Stoops to Conquer does poke fun at certain things, such as codes of courtship and gender roles, class distinctions, and the marriage market, all of which are going to be connected to the central relationship of Marlowe and Kate Hardcastle. But Goldsmith's satire is far less biting and more benign than Molière's. The play's subtitle, The Mistakes of a Knight, tell us that the comedy will involve mistaken identities, and it hints at the slapstick confusion and dramatic irony that we're going to find. This good-natured approach to comedy is symptomatic of Goldsmith himself, who was once described this way, quote, "All the motion of his nature moved in the direction of the true, the natural, the sweet, and the gentle." He was not, however, a sentimentalist. Goldsmith wanted his plays to make audiences laugh heartily, not to weep the so-called happy tears like some of his contemporaries were trying to do. Goldsmith was an Irishman who attended Trinity College, but was expelled, curiously, for leading a riot on a prison. He drifted around Europe for a while, acquired the expensive bad habits of young men of his time, and failed at various jobs before leaving Ireland and moving to London. There he worked as a hack writer in the notorious center of cheap journalism, a place called Grub Street. But he made connections with major writers of his time, such as Samuel Johnson, and they helped him launch his career as a man of letters. Goldsmith became a poet and a novelist, but he's best known as a playwright, and She Stoops to Conquer is his most famous drama. In a preface to the play, he distinguishes his work from the sentimentality of supposed comedies like Richard Steele's The Tender Husband, plays of the time that featured virtuous men and women with no real villains and that sought to induce in the audience melting sympathy rather than laughter. Goldsmith, in this preface, ridicules that tradition of comedy as essentially not comic. He says that this brand of sentimental comedy blurs the lines between tragedy and comedy by summoning up pity in the audience for ordinary men and women. And citing Aristotle, Goldsmith notes that pity is, after all, a tragic emotion reserved for figures of high rank, and that it has no place in middle-class comedy at all. Goldsmith insists that you can't have comedy without heartily laughing at things that are ridiculous in human nature, even though, as I've suggested, the satire is far gentler than Molière's. But there is no sense of the ridiculous in 18th century sentimental comedy of the kind that Goldsmith is opposing. And in fact, Goldsmith was afraid that the popularity of those weepy plays would drive what he called true comedy, the kind he's writing, into extinction. They were, in fact, Goldsmith believed, these plays encouraging people to lose their sense of humor. Well, to contradistinguish his own brand of dramatic comedy, then, Goldsmith calls his plays laughing comedies. But he doesn't encourage a cruel or cynical laughter. And it's important to note this, I think, because in this respect, his work contrasts with another type of English drama at the opposite end of the comic spectrum. A particular species of comedy that prevailed in England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries prior to Goldsmith. And that was called Restoration comedy, so called because it began when Charles II, the king, was restored to the throne of Britain after the Puritans had deposed his predecessor. Well, those Restoration comedies, if you read them, are wickedly funny and bawdy, and they include such works as Wycherley's The Country Wife and Etheridge's The Man of Mode. These plays are propelled by a constant barrage of sex jokes, and the elaborate plots in Restoration comedy typically involve the cuckolding of naive older husbands by clever playboys and by their libidinous wives. The view of human nature in these rather cruel comedies is as bleak as sentimentalist comedies are sappy. Some of the characters are clever and some are stupid, but they're all essentially aggressive, nasty, and self-centered. In fact, overall, Restoration comedies seem to reflect the worldview of the late 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who described life as nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this is certainly not the case with She Stoops to Conquer, where even the selfish Mrs. Hardcastle may be ridiculous, but she's never menacing or despicable. Now, as we turn to She Stoops to Conquer now, note one final aspect of Goldsmith's approach to comedy. Unlike Molière, he makes no explicit claims for comic drama as a moral force. Okay? He notes that his plays make us laugh at human folly, but his emphasis is primarily to amuse us rather than to instruct us ethically by exposing vice. All right, now, the first act of Goldsmith's play is a marvel of economy. It's just 10 pages long, and yet it sets up the entire machinery of the comic plot, beginning with the setting, an old-fashioned country house where Mr. and Mrs. Hardcastle reside, a couple, both of whom have been married previously and who have very different attitudes toward the modern world outside, as we see in their opening conversation. Mrs. Hardcastle begins, "I vow, Mr. Hardcastle, you're very particular. Is there a creature in the whole country but ourselves that does not take a trip to town now and then to rub off the rust a little?" She wants to go to London. She wants to be fashionable. Hardcastle replies, "I wonder why London cannot keep its fools at home. In my time, the follies of the town crept closer, slowly among us, but now they travel faster than a stagecoach." He wants to be as far away from London and its fine and pretentious way of life as possible. Mrs. Hardcastle observes, your times were fine times, sir. Indeed, you've been telling us this for many a long year. Here we live in an old rambling mansion that looks for all the world like an inn, but that we never see our company." To which Hardcastle, delighted at the idea of living in such a place, says, "I love it here. I love everything that's old friends, old times, old manners, old books, old wine, and I believe, Dorothy, taking her hand, you'll own that I have been pretty fond of an old wife." To which she takes objection, "I'm not as old as that. No. Now, note that one key detail that we learn in this opening that will prove crucial is that the old house looks like an inn, even though Hardcastle is a country gentleman, a man of leisure, and not an innkeeper. Now, the house's appearance will allow Mrs. Hardcastle's jokester son, Tony Lumpkin, to misdirect Marlowe and Hastings to it under the impression that it is, in fact, not the residence of the distinguished Hardcastle, but rather actually is an old inn. It's a misunderstanding which gives rise to many others over the course of about 24 hours. Another thing that Goldsmith establishes in the opening passage I read is that there are thematic binaries at work in this play from the start. That is to say, opposing principles that are going to be part of the comic texture. These oppositions include Hardcastle's love of tradition and all old things, as suggested by his very feudal name, Hardcastle, versus his somewhat younger wife's desire for modernity and contemporary fashion, all things new. Hardcastle hates and distrusts the modern world, and he also dislikes London in particular as the very center of modernity, which is, of course, where Mrs. Hardcastle says she wants, if not to go live permanently, at least to take a trip so that they can shake off some of the rust. Thus, Goldsmith relates the poles of tradition versus modernity, and also in doing so, the poles or the contrast between the countryside on the one hand, that Hardcastle loves, and the city, the center of modernity to which Mrs. Hardcastle wants to go. And built into those polarities, there's also the suggestion of a difference between age and youth. Mr. Hardcastle is older, approximately 20 years older than his second wife, who regards herself indeed as inappropriately a member of a younger generation and would like to be thought as young, even though he speaks of her as his sweet old wife. Mrs. Hardcastle's social ambitions are reflected in her discontentment with the house and with their rather lowly neighbors. She craves excitement and attention. She wants to rub shoulders with a better class of people, both for herself and for her slacker son, Tony, who will inherit his late father, that is her first husband's, fortune when he comes of age. Now, Mr. Hardcastle dismisses his wife's social climbing and social pretensions and fantasies of appearing young and laughs at these preoccupations because, indeed, the truth is that she is not a fashionable woman, and she is certainly not a member of the generation that, say, Kate and Marlowe and Tony belong to, despite her pretensions to fashion and a certain kind of au courant vivacity. Now, Hardcastle also has harsh things to say about his wife's son, Tony, whom he regards, not incorrectly, as an undisciplined lout. And he blames Mrs. Hardcastle for ruining Tony by a combination of overindulging him, never using any sense of resistance to his bad habits on the one hand, and also ruining him by her nagging him constantly to do her bidding. And in particular, nagging him to marry his cousin Constance, so as to allow Mrs. Hardcastle, through Tony, to acquire her niece's extensive fortune. Okay. Now, as we'll see, Tony has rebelled against both of these forms of his mother's poor parenting, both the overindulgence and the attempted manipulation of his marital future. His rebellion takes the form, among other things, of spending days drinking with lowlifes and playing pranks on Hardcastle and others, including his mother, but really playing pranks on any figure whom he regards as a source of authority. Mr. Hardcastle notes this quite early on in the conversation with his wife, who has been going on about how I was but 20 when I was brought to bed with Tony I had by Mr. Lumpkin, my first husband. And the mention of Tony's name leads Mr. Hardcastle to grumble about him. "Oh, come, Mr. Hardcastle," she tells him, "you must allow the boy a little humor. I'd sooner allow him a horse pond. If burning the footman's shoes, frightening the maids, and worrying the kittens be humor, then he has it. It was but yesterday he fastened my wig on the back of my chair, and when I went to make a bow, I popped my bald head in Mr. Fizzle's face." Pranks. Adolescent pranks, even though Tony is a young man of at least 20. Now, we are then, from the beginning, prepared for Tony's antics before we ever see him. We laugh at them in the description of Mr. Hardcastle inadvertently pulling off his wig, but we also understand that these practical jokes are the work of a dissolute, pampered, mischievous son who has been wasting his life in the alehouse which he belovedly goes to every day and sings of, the Three Pigeons. Now, in part, Tony's antics are a sign of laziness and boredom, suggested by the very name Lumpkin that suggests a certain inertia, but his antics are also, as I've implied, a rebellion against Mrs. Hardcastle and her combination of spoiling him through a lack of discipline and at the same time attempting to manipulate him through her avaricious plans to increase his inheritance by getting him to marry Constance. Now, Tony's resistance to his mother is fitly revealed very early on when he crosses the stage as his mother is speaking to Hardcastle, and she tries to stop him. As Tony enters, she says, "Tony, where are you going, my charmer? Won't you give Papa and I a little of your company, lovely?" "No, I'm in haste, mother. I cannot stay. The Three Pigeons expects me down every moment. There's fun going forward." An alehouse, an old place. I thought so. That's where he's going, Mr. Hardcastle says. "Yes, She says, "A low, paltry set of fellows." To which Tony replies, "Not so low neither. There's Dick Muggins, the exerciseman, Jack Slang, the horse doctor, little Adam Dabb that grinds the music box, and Tom Twist that spins the pewter platter. Oh, pray don't disappoint them for one night in the least. Oh, just disappoint them one night. Stay with us." "Oh, as for disappointing them," Tony says, "I should not so much mind, but I can't abide to disappoint myself." And when she tries to hold him back, to detain him, we are told that Tony says, "We'll see which is strongest, you or I," and exits, hauling her out as she tries unsuccessfully to pull him back in. Well, Tony and his willful mother, of course, throughout the play are pulling in opposite directions, and it's encapsulated in this slapstick moment. Here, Tony pulls her off stage. She can't stop him. He gets the better of her in this first scene in which he appears, and he's going to get the better of his mother, in fact, in the play's most hilarious scene that comes later and in scenes in between as well. Now, this brief moment, then, introduces the play's most important theme: parent-child relations, something that Goldsmith's comedy, if you think of it, has very much in common with Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. In both plays, we have parent-child relations that are set in contrast with one another, but with this difference. In The Merchant of Venice, the measure of a child's virtue was obedience to the father's will, something that Portia submitted to, even if unhappily, and was rewarded for submitting to, and something that Jessica, we saw, violated and is unhappy thereafter. But in She Stoops to Conquer, the value of the parent-child relationship isn't determined by the child's willingness to submit to the parental will, but rather by the capacity of the parent and child together to compromise. That is, to find a basis for agreement which is founded upon mutual love and respect. Obviously, Mrs. Hardcastle and Tony completely fail that test. There is no sense of mutual love or respect there. But we do find that loving balance in the relationship set in contrast to it, the relationship of Hardcastle and his daughter, Kate. Now, although they are of different generations, different social attitudes, and different temperaments, this father and daughter have nonetheless struck a balance over the years between filial duty and personal freedom, a balance that is based on a negotiation, but is also based clearly on mutual respect and love. When Kate first enters, she is, as Hardcastle notes, because it is in the morning, "Dressed out as usual, my Kate. Goodness, what a quantity of superfluous silk hast thou got about thee, girl. I could never teach the fools of the age that indigent world could be clothed in the trimmings of the vain like you." In short, he's making fun of her fashionable style of dress, but not in a way that is biting, but rather in an affectionate way. And Kate understands this. "You know our agreement, father. You allow me the morning to receive and pay visits and to dress in my own manner, as I am, and in the evening I put on my housewife's dress to please you." Now, note that Kate is dressed stylishly in this scene because it is, of course, early in the day. But later she will, in the late afternoon and evening, dress so plainly to please her father that Marlowe will mistakenly take her as a barmaid in the most important confusion of identity in a play that will be full of such confusions. Now, like Orgon in Tartuffe, Mr. Hardcastle has selected a husband for his daughter, Kate, in advance. But unlike Orgon, Mr. Hardcastle makes it clear that although he has made this selection based on a kind of patriarchal expectation, he will not force Kate to marry this fellow Marlowe, who he tells her is coming for a visit that very day. This Marlowe, who is the son of his old friend. Yes, he loves old things. He includes old friends among the old things he loves. Now, I sent you a link to the scene I'm referring to that comes from a 2008 British television film adaptation of the play with Susanna Fielding as Kate and Tim Bell as Hardcastle. This is the description of how they relate to one another with the news that this young man is coming. Hardcastle says, then to be plain with you, Kate, I expect the young gentleman I have chosen to be your husband from town this very day. Okay, to which Kate then says, rather than protesting, it's 1,000 to 1 I shan't like him. Our meeting will be so formal and so like a thing of business that I shall find no room for friendship or esteem. Hardcastle then adds, depend upon it, child, I'll never control your choice. But Mr. Marlowe, whom I've pitched upon, is the son of an old friend, Sir Charles Marlowe, of whom you have heard me talk so often. The young gentleman has been bred a scholar and is designed for an employment in the service of his country. I'm told he's a man of excellent understanding. Is he? Very generous. I believe I shall like him. Young and brave. I'm sure I shall like him. And very handsome. My dear papa, say no more, kissing his hand. He's mine. I shall have him. And to crown all, Kate, he's one of the most bashful and reserved young fellows in the world. You have frozen me to death again, father. That word reserved has undone all the rest of his accomplishments. A reserved lover, it is said, always makes a suspicious husband. On the contrary, modesty seldom resides in a breast that is not enriched with nobler virtues. It was that very feature in his character that first struck me. To which Kate replies, he must have more striking features to catch me, I promise you. However, if it be so young and so handsome and so everything as you mentioned, I believe he'll still do. I think I'll have him. Okay. Now, Kate's repeated phrase, I think I'll have him, is not just a response to her father's generally appealing description of Marlowe, but it's also a sign that she wants to be agreeable with her father's choice. It's a sign of her trust, too, that her father has her best interests at heart and would only select for her a man he felt was worthy. So, unlike Marianne, then, in Tartuffe, who would rather die than marry Tartuffe at her father's insistence, Kate is rather inclined to accept Hardcastle's choice even before she meets Marlowe. She's predisposed in advance because she trusts and loves her father and knows that her father will never force Marlowe on her. Second, note, unlike Marianne, who is engaged to Valentine, Kate is not affianced or in love with anyone else, okay? So there is no sense of a tension between what Hardcastle is asking her to consider and some other love interest. No. And finally, the most important difference, I think, between Hardcastle's choosing a husband and Orgon's is that Kate knows that Hardcastle, unlike Orgon, will never force her against her will, that there will be no coercion, that she retains ultimately her free will and agency to say yes or no, to choose the man that she wishes, something, after all, that neither Marianne nor, for that matter, Portia enjoy. Thus, Goldsmith presents a balance of parent and child rooted in a loving respect for the father's authority on the part of the daughter and a respect for the child's freedom on the part of the father. Now, you'll note that in this conversation, Goldsmith sets up several more elements in the play's comic machinery. First, the agreement of Kate's dress at different times of the day about what she'll wear in the morning and what she'll wear later. That change of dress will, of course, cause Marlowe to think that he is in fact conversing to two different women when he is in Kate's presence. And this seemingly impossible or inconceivable mistake is in fact possible only because, as Hardcastle implies, Marlowe is such a bashful, modest individual when he's around fine ladies. So afraid of them, in fact, that we're told he never lifts his head, so that he actually never sees Kate when he first encounters her in her fancy morning dress. Only when he mistakes her more humble attire for an outfit of a barmaid and thinks it's an old inn, he therefore assumes that it is another person because he has never actually seen what Kate looks like. He's afraid to look at her. Miss Neville confirms what Hardcastle has reported about Marlowe, but she adds a very important additional detail when she and Kate converse a little bit thereafter. She says, as I live, the most intimate friend of Mr. Hastings, my admirer, is this fellow Marlowe who's coming. They are never asunder. I believe you must have seen when we lived in town. To which Kate says, no, never. Well, Marlowe, Miss Neville says, Constance says, is a very singular character, I assure you. Among women of our reputation and virtue, he is indeed the modestest man alive. But this acquaintance give him a very different character, those I know, among creatures of another stamp. You understand me? Creatures of another stamp that cause Marlowe to behave differently with them. Who could they be? Common women, not fine ladies, not gentlewomen of good breeding. With these lower class women, Constance would have Kate understand this Marlowe fellow is not inhibited, not bashful. Rather, the implication is a very different character. He is perhaps overly aggressive. Now, among the play's binaries, perhaps the most artificial one, and the one certainly that Goldsmith satirizes, I think, the most, is Marlowe's prejudicial and unjust distinction involving women of different classes, whom he treats as if they were not defined simply by their different classes, but almost as if these women were of different species. Well, given Marlowe's preposterously different behavior with women of these different ranks, you can see in advance how Kate will have to stoop to get to know him. That is to say, she will have to impersonate or allow him to believe that she is in fact a barmaid at one point. As we'll see, however, that word stoop has many other meanings in the play that accumulate. But in the simplest sense, Kate will need to stoop to letting Marlowe think she is actually a tavern girl in order to assess his character and assess his potential, therefore, as a husband. Goldsmith puts another plank into the comic foundation that I've said he's been building so economically in Act 1, when we learn that Constance Neville's suitor, Hastings, is Marlowe's best friend. Now, Constance wants to marry Hastings, but knows that she has to hide this intention from her aunt, Mrs. Hardcastle, because her aunt, Mrs. Hardcastle, wants her to marry her son and Constance's cousin, Tony Lumpkin. Thus, to keep her aunt from discovering her true feelings for Hastings, Constance pretends to entertain Tony as a suitor in order to disguise her love for Hastings. Not that Tony has the least intention of courting her. Like Tony, she is not yet old enough to have control of her inheritance, and she wants to be sure to protect that inheritance, in particular the gems that have been left to her, at a time when Mrs. Hardcastle is especially eager to gain control of that inheritance by wedding her to Tony and therefore consolidating the fortunes over which she feels she should have control. Now, based on Kate's conversation with Constance Neville, we can see that both women are going to need to engage in a certain deception, a deceit, in order to marry, or at least have the hope of marrying, the men in whom they are interested. Kate is going to have to deceive Marlowe about who she really is, and Constance is going to have to deceive the acquisitive Mrs. Hardcastle about her intentions with regard to Hastings. Now, as we've seen in other comedies, deceit can sometimes be poisonous. Deceit can sometimes be morally corrupt, like Tartuffe's thoroughgoing deception and hypocrisy with regard to Orgon. But deception can also sometimes, we've noted in these comedies, be a kind of moral necessity, as, for example, when Portia pretended to be a male judge to save Antonio's life, and when Elmire pretended that she wanted an affair with Tartuffe in order to expose him to her husband. Well, here too we'll see then that deceptions are entirely necessary. So all the planks of the play's comic foundation have been laid up until this point, and all of the misunderstandings that are going to ensue are set up, and they make preparation then for the final scene in Act 1, which takes place at the Three Pigeons Tavern, that now, after all this preparation, sets the comic plot in motion. We find Tony here in his normal element. He's a clown whom we sometimes laugh at because he's an illiterate buffoon, and there are many things, as we'll see, he simply doesn't understand. But we also laugh with him very often because despite his stupidity, he is an irresistible prankster and sometimes a very clever one. His life is devoted to drinking, cavorting with wenches, and to cockfights, notwithstanding his wealthy background. The song that Tony sings when we first meet him at the Three Pigeons expresses his disdain for everything respectable, for education, for social conventions and manners, for sobriety, for restraint, for religion. All of it seems covered in the song that Tony sings that he has made up for the alehouse. Let schoolmasters puzzle their brain with grammar and nonsense and learning. Good liquor, I stoutly maintain, gives genus a better discerning. And then he sings another. When Methodist preachers come down a-preaching that drinking is sinful, I'll wager the rascals a crown, they always preach best with a skinful. He dislikes religious hypocrisy, he dislikes good manners, he dislikes affectations. And especially high on the list of the things that Tony hates is the fashionable, class-bound world that his mother wants him to join, and that indeed she herself wants to join. A world that indeed Tony sees reflected in Marlowe and Hastings just from what he hears about them when he learns that outside the tavern there are a couple of guys who have come from London in a carriage and have gotten lost, and that they are about to enter the Three Pigeons Tavern in search of directions. No sooner does Tony hear from the owner what these men look like, that is to say, like Frenchmen, pretentious in their dress and fastidious in their manners, and no sooner does he learn that they have come from London than he decides to trick them just on the basis of a kind of instinctive dislike as soon as they enter. And so, when they do, we are told that, pray, gentlemen, when they ask about Hardcastle and how to get to Hardcastle's house, Tony says, pray, gentlemen, is not that the same Hardcastle, a cross-grained, old-fashioned, whimsical fellow with an ugly face, a daughter, and a pretty son? To which Hastings replies, we have not seen the gentleman, but he has the family you mention. To which Tony observes, the daughter, a tall, traipsing, trolloping, talkative maypole, the son, a pretty well-bred, agreeable youth, and everybody fond of. Marlowe then observes, our information differs in this. The daughter is said to be well-bred and beautiful, the son an awkward booby, reared up and spoiled at his mother's apron string. To which Tony replies, then, gentlemen, all I have to tell you is that you won't reach Mr. Hardcastle's house this night, I believe. Tony realizes at this minute, okay, I'm going to teach these bastards who refer to me as an awkward booby. And thus, having already decided he will trick them somehow, the particular trick now seems totally to come to mind here. But what motivates Tony's trickery in sending Marlowe and Hastings on a route to what they believe is an inn, which in fact is the Hardcastle house they're looking for? What motivates the trickery? Well, first, it is an act of revenge on Hardcastle himself for Hardcastle's insults directed against Tony. Hardcastle regards Tony as essentially a wastrel, and he knows that these class-conscious men, when they enter the house thinking it's an inn, are going to insult Hardcastle because they will assume he is an innkeeper, and that their insults will cause Hardcastle pain, and that is something Tony likes. In fact, Tony says at one point, father-in-law has been calling me a whelp and a hound this half year. Now, if pleased, I'll be so revenged upon the old grumbleman he won't forget it. Yeah, okay. I'm going to cause him embarrassment and dismay by misdirecting these individuals who will think that he is merely an innkeeper. A little bit later, again, we are told that Tony says, no, I'll tell you, though the landlord is rich and you're going to leave off business, so he wants to be thought, this guy you're about to see, he wants to be thought a gentleman, saving your presence. Yes, okay. Preparing them, so they imagine, for a class-climbing, irritating inn owner. But the second reason that, the second motivation in this gesture on Tony's part that moves the entire plot is that it's an attack on newfangled styles, on the world of London, on everything that his mother wants him to embrace, and that he despises in part because she wants it. Now, ironically, if you think of it, Tony and Hardcastle, despite their mutual dislike, are united in a shared disdain for those things, for modernity, for fine manners, and for pretension. So he is striking out against those things as well, because he doesn't just want to embarrass his stepfather, Hardcastle. He wants to embarrass these two individuals as well, to whom he has taken an immediate dislike even before he saw them, just on the basis of what they represent. But above all, Tony plays this trick that sets the plot in motion for his own delight, his own amusement, because he takes such pleasure in comic, in the irreverence of it. He loves to laugh, and he doesn't miss any trick at all. As, for example, the mention of how Hastings and Marlowe will recognize the place, the inn, when they see it. You'll see a pair of large horns over the door. That's the sign. Drive up into the yard and call out. A pair of large horns over the door, suggesting, of course, that the owner is a cuckold. Just delighting in that kind of private insult. And he's not the only one who enjoys the humor of this, the trickery of this, just as a source of laughter. The landlord, the owner of the Three Pigeons, at the end of the scene, as Marlowe and Hastings have left, says, "Ah, bless your heart, Tony, for a sweet, pleasant, damn mischievous son of a whore you are." And that's an apt description. Okay, now, unlike Tartuffe's deceit, this kind of trickery on Tony's part, while it is embarrassing to others, is not malicious, ultimately, nor is it really self-interested. It's playful, it's mischievous, it's a little rebellious, yes, but the fact is that unlike Tartuffe, in his deceit, Tony isn't gaining anything out of this. He isn't gaining money, he isn't gaining power, he isn't really gaining anything except a little bit of revenge on his stepfather and a good laugh by disrupting the plans of this stuffy pair of men who regard themselves as his superior. So, recognizing that, I think, recognizing the essentially non-malicious nature of this practical joke, the audience then is not only in on the joke, but we're meant to enjoy the joke along with Tony and through all the scenes of dramatic irony that will follow. Okay, as Act 2 opens, Mr. Hardcastle is trying to teach his farm workers how to act like house servants so as to impress Marlowe when he arrives. And this is ironic if you think of it, because as we've seen, Hardcastle hates high manners and petty class distinctions. Even though he's a traditionalist in his own manners and style and dress, he is untraditional for a man of his landed class, in that he regards his servants as friends. And indeed, he refers to his entire estate as Liberty Hall, because he is not a man of hidebound class distinctions. He tells one of his servants, Diggory, "You're too talkative. Then if I happen to say a good thing when Marlowe is here, or to tell a good story at table, you must not all burst out a-laughing, as if, you made part of the company. No, you must not." To which Diggory says, "Then, God, your worship, you must not tell the story of old Groose in the gunroom. I can't help but laughing at that. We've laughed at that these 20 years. To which Hardcastle says, yes, the story's a good one. Well, honest Diggory, you may laugh at that, but please remember to be attentive." In the same way that Hardcastle is unconditional or untraditional for an old patriarch, in the freedom with which he gives his servants and in the fact that they are his friends as much as they are his employers, he's also untraditional, as we've seen, in the freedom that he gives his daughter Kate. A traditional patriarch would, of course, be much more demanding and would regard his will as everything. Well, the comic misunderstandings at the heart of the play begin when Marlowe and Hastings arrive at what they think is an old inn. But before they confront Hardcastle, the two of them discuss their preparations for their upcoming meetings with Kate and with Constance. Hastings looks forward to being with Constance, the woman that he's in love with, while Marlowe, on the other hand, dreads encountering a fine lady, this woman Kate, that his father wants him to court. But consider the way in which they describe these prospects. Hastings says, "I have often been surprised that you, who have been so much in the world with your natural good sense and your many opportunities, could never yet acquire a requisite share of assurance with women." Well, Marlowe says, that's the Englishman's malady. Tell me, George, where could I have learned that assurance you talk of? My life has been chiefly spent in college, at an inn, in seclusion from the lovely part of that creation that chiefly teaches men confidence, and I don't know that I was ever familiarly acquainted with a single modest woman, except my mother, but among females of another class. Well, yes, we know them. You're imprudent enough with those, for all conscience. To which Marlowe says, but they are of us, you know. Hastings then says, but in the company of women of reputation, I never saw such an idiot as you, such a trembler. You look for all the world as if you wanted an opportunity for stealing out of the room. To which Marlowe says, well, I do. Why, George, I can't say fine things to them. Fine women, they freeze me, petrify me. They talk of a comet or a burning mountain or some such bagatelle. To me, a modest woman dressed out in all her finery is the most tremendous object of the whole creation. Hastings laughs at this. At this rate, man, how can you ever expect to marry? To which Marlowe says, never, unless as among kings and princes my bride were to be courted by proxy. If indeed, like an Eastern bridegroom, one were to be introduced to the wife he never saw before, it might be endured. But to go through with all the terrors of a formal courtship, together with the episode of aunts, grandmothers, and cousins, and at last to blurt out the broad, staring question of, Madam, will you marry me? No, that's a strain much above what I can assure you. I don't think I shall venture to look at Kate Hardcastle's face. I won't look till I see my father again. Well, note here that there are multiple sources of comedy at work. Why do we laugh at this exchange? Well, first of all, we laugh at the verbal incongruity. Marlowe's magnification of the danger of encountering a fine lady is framed in the language of epics, okay? Of comets and burning mountains, of the most tremendous things in the world. Just the idea of meeting the young woman whom he has come to see fills him with paralyzing fear. And indeed, this is reinforced a little bit later when the two of them talk about how they are going to arm themselves, so to speak, for their encounters with the two young women that they have come to see. And again, we're struck at the incongruity, because as the two of them talk about what they're going to wear in order to impress these ladies, they do so in the language of warfare, of military campaigns. Marlowe, in particular, sees courtship as such a terrible ordeal that he must dress in a certain way as if he were arming himself just in order to protect himself. Marlowe says, I've been thinking, George, of changing our traveling dress in the morning. I'm grown confoundedly ashamed of mine. To which Hastings says, I intend opening the campaign with a white and gold. Marlowe then says, yes, George, if I were to open the campaign too fiercely at first, we may want ammunition, but before it's over, I think to reserve the embroidery for a secure retreat. Marlowe's already anticipating a retreat, but he's considering exactly what he should wear in having to try to protect himself or endure the meeting that is upcoming. Now, note that we laugh then at the incongruity of the language of Marlowe's epic and military sense of encountering something terrible and intimidating, totally inappropriate to an encounter with a gentle young woman. But a second related source of comedy in the scene is what we might think of as gender inversion. Marlowe's extreme modesty and the fear and preoccupation with his clothing in the face of meeting Kate cast him not in the role of a dominant male, but rather in the typical role of a female at this particular moment in cultural history. It is he who is terrified. It is he who feels vulnerable and blushing and modest. He imagines well-bred young ladies as terrifying creatures, and his fancy clothing is merely a little armor or a little self-defense that he feels sure will fail and that he will have to leave the room. Obviously, if you think of it, Marlowe fetishizes clothing, both his own clothing, but also the clothing of others, men and women. And as a result, Marlowe, as we'll see, this individual who has, we're told, led a rather cloistered life as a student prior to coming to London and meeting other men, this individual has a rather superficial tendency to judge people on the basis of what they wear. And this will help to explain why Marlowe so easily mistakes the plainly dressed Kate, whom he sees in the late afternoon and early evening, for a barmaid. He has never seen a lady dressed down before this way in London or anywhere else. The only women he's ever seen dressed anything like this are women who work in taverns. Now, we also laugh in this conversation between Marlowe and Hastings at the exaggerated distinction that Marlowe in particular draws between two different classes of women, and the absurd paradox that the only kind of woman he feels comfortable around are those that his narrow class prejudices have taught him, quote, to despise. And yet, even as he says he despises, that is, looks down on these women, he also says that he's so comfortable with them that he tells Hastings in that important phrase, they are of us, meaning I relate to them because I feel comfortable around them, even though I must look down on them. Obviously, well-bred ladies are not of us, or not of me anyway. I can't feel comfortable around them. Now, obviously, this attitude is not just then a contradiction, because in fact they are all women, even though he treats them like different species. But this class distinction that is so firmly established about women in Marlowe's mind is also a moral impediment, one that he's going to have to learn to overcome in Liberty Hall if he is to be worthy of Kate as a husband, and for that matter to be worthy of Hardcastle as a son-in-law. Okay, there's clearly a sense of ethical limitation in a snobbery that is that intense. Now, Marlowe's class snobbishness is on display then, even before Kate arrives, and his supercilious treatment is clear in the way he reacts to her father, whom he thinks of, mistakenly, as a nosy innkeeper, a country innkeeper who has the temerity to engage these two cosmopolitan gentlemen in familiar conversation as if he were somehow their social equal, rather than merely a man of country business. What a breach of etiquette. What a transgression of class boundaries, Marlowe thinks. Well, finally, in this opening scene in the Hardcastle house in which they have arrived, we laugh in particular because of the misunderstanding it produces between them and Hardcastle. All of it an escalating exercise in dramatic irony and punctuated by baffled asides on the part of both Marlowe and Hardcastle in this misunderstanding. Marlowe orders a glass of punch. Hardcastle is astonished. Since when do guests order things? What, my good friend, if you gave us a glass of punch in the meantime, it would help us carry on the siege, that is again military language, with vigor. Hardcastle, punch, sir? Aside, this is the most unaccountable kind of modesty I've ever seen. This is not a modest man. Marlowe, yes, sir, punch. A glass of warm punch after our journey will be comfortable. This is Liberty Hall, you know, as you say. Oh, here's a cup, sir. Marlowe was saying, So this fellow in his Liberty Hall will only let us have just what he pleases? Marlowe, taking up the cup. I hope you'll find it to your mind. I have prepared it with my own hands, and I believe you'll own the ingredients are tolerable. Will you be so good as to pledge me, sir? Here, Mr. Marlowe, here is our better acquaintance. Drinks. Marlowe aside. What? He wants to toast? He would think of toasting with us. A very impudent fellow, this. But he's a character, and I'll humor a little, sir. Yes. Hastings aside. I see this fellow wants to give us his company and forgets that he's merely an innkeeper before he had learned to be a gentleman. They assume that this rather unctuous behavior, as they take it, is the sign of a social climber, and they want nothing of it. Now, the dramatic irony here for the reader or viewer is twofold, because both parties, Marlowe and Hastings on the one hand and Hardcastle on the other, are unaware of what we know, in that Hardcastle doesn't realize that the men have mistaken him for an innkeeper. He recognizes Marlowe, but assumes, of course, that Marlowe and his friend Hastings are simply being rude, presumptuous young city folk. It seems to feed into Hardcastle's idea of what the city will do to a young man. This is simply the way they are now. Well, the scene builds to a comic climax in which Marlowe and Hastings order dinner insistently, as if they were at an inn looking at the menu, after interrupting Hardcastle's many attempts to tell them and impress them with his military exploits, which they see as peremptory and have absolutely no willingness to listen to. Marlowe reading. For the first course at the top, a pig and prune sauce. This is what Hardcastle has planned, an elaborate dinner in which he's going to impress his friend's son with the hospitality of his home. He's even had it printed up as a menu, which, of course, Marlowe assumes is the menu of an inn. For the first course at the top, pig and prune sauce. Hastings. Damn your pig, I say. Marlowe. And damn your prune sauce, say I. Hardcastle. And yet, gentlemen, to men that are hungry, pig with prune sauce is a very good eating. Marlowe. At the bottom, a calf's tongue with brains. Hastings. Let your brains be knocked out, good sir. I don't like them. Marlowe. Oh, you may clap them on a plate themselves. I do. Hardcastle aside. Their impudence confounds me. Gentlemen, you are my guest. Make what alterations you please. Is there anything you wish to retrench or alter, gentlemen? Marlowe. Item. A pork pie, a boiled rabbit and sausages, a Florentine of shaking pudding, and a dish of tiff-taff tun. That's what we want. Tiff-taffy cream. Be gone. Now, at this point, Goldsmith introduces the subplot involving Mrs. Hardcastle's niece, Constance Neville. The second romance plot in the play, which is entwined with the Kate Marlowe romance plot. As Hastings' name suggests, he is a hasty man. That is to say, he's in a hurry. He's impetuous. He has come to visit Constance as arranged, but he wants her to elope with him. She, on the other hand, wants to wait, as her name, Constance, would suggest. Wait, that is, until she can secure the gems that are her legacy and that her Aunt Hardcastle guards until she is old enough to claim her inheritance. Well, the pair, Constance and Hastings, agree to hold off on eloping until Constance can then get that inheritance by deceiving Mrs. Hardcastle in some way. The plan is that Constance will pretend, in the meantime, to be infatuated with Tony, as Mrs. Hardcastle wants, even more than she has heretofore, and that Hastings then will conceal his identity, as he does, and his intentions on Constance from Mrs. Hardcastle. Instead, under an assumed identity, he will charm and flatter the middle-aged lady as only a stylish Londoner can, doing so without concealing whom he really is. And so he does it this way. Mrs. Hardcastle says, I vow that there's nothing in the world I love so much as talk of London. Because although she knows that his name is Hastings, she does not know that he is, in fact, a court suitor of her daughter. He's concealed that part of himself. They're there, he says, "You amaze me. From your air and manner, I concluded that you had bred all your life either at the Ranelagh or St. James," flattering her, imagining that he regards her as a woman of sophistication and breeding. Mrs. Hardcastle says, "I'm in love with the town, and that serves to raise me above some of our neighboring rustics who can have a manner that have never seen the Pantheon, the Grotto Gardens, and the Borough, and such places where the nobility chiefly resides." She worships the nobility. "Pray," she asks Mr. Hastings, "how do you like this head? How do you like this hairdo?" "Extremely elegant and déjà gay, upon my word, madam. Your friseur is a Frenchman, I suppose?" "Oh, I protest, I dressed it myself from a print in the lady's memorandum book for the last year." "Indeed," Hastings says, "such a head in a side box at the Playhouse would draw as many gazers as my Lady Mayoress at a city ball." Now, the comedy here arises from our sense of a double discourse. That is, Hastings' words have one meaning, and Mrs. For us, and another for Mrs. Hardcastle, such as when he says that her head would draw many gazers. Indeed, she takes it to mean, and he means for her to take it as mean, that it would be gazes of admiration. What he means privately, and what we understand, is, of course, people at the city ball seeing her in a box would be amazed at how preposterous she looks. She would be an object of astonishment and derision because of her naive attempt to look stylish and younger by styling her own coiffure from the lady's memorandum book. Thus, this individual, Mr. Hastings, whom she refers to without knowing that indeed he is courting her niece, seems to feed into her fantasy of being a lady in the town, all the while privately mocking her. When Constance and Hastings informed Tony of their plan to try to trick Mrs. Hardcastle out of Constance's gems and to run off together, Tony is immediately on board because he is grateful at the prospect of being free of Constance and of his mother's constantly nagging him to court her. And therefore he is willing to steal the jewels and in so doing send Constance and Hastings on their way, to speed them, much to his mother's dismay. Well, when Constance and Hastings meet, she tells him that he is actually, indeed, at Hardcastle's house, okay? Their intended destination, not at an inn. She disabuses him of that. But curiously, when he finds that out, the two agree to perpetuate Marlowe's error, perpetuate Marlowe's mistake, rather than correcting that delusion, rather than telling him, hey, this is in fact where you're meant to be. Why? Why this ongoing deception or this suppression of the embarrassing truth? Well, notably, it is Constance's idea, and she seems to understand the need for this ongoing ruse for two reasons. First, if Marlowe discovered his mistake at this point, he would almost certainly insist on leaving. And this would be a problem for Hastings, who is, after all, posing as his traveling companion and would then have to go with him when, in fact, what he wants to do is to elope with Constance. But they know Marlowe, and given his temperament, and given the idea that he has inadvertently insulted the father of the woman he's supposed to be courting, he would just have to leave, and that would not be good for the Constance-Hastings relationship. The other thing that Constance knows, and that certainly prompts her to want to hold back from revealing the truth to Marlowe, is that Kate wants to meet this man. She's been intrigued by what her father has told her, and if Marlowe flees in shame and humiliation at his error, then he'll never have a chance to meet her, and Kate, therefore, will never have a chance to evaluate him as a suitor, because they have not even yet met. But the first meeting, then, does occur because, of course, Marlowe continues to be deluded. It occurs in the early part of the day when Kate is wearing her fashionable clothes. When she enters, after taking a walk, and Hastings introduces her to Marlowe, Marlowe assumes that Kate is not indeed at home, as she has returned after her walk, but rather has stopped at the inn. And Hastings doesn't disabuse him of this misconception. At the same time, Kate doesn't know that Marlowe believes that he is indeed at an inn. Having already been embarrassed by Hardcastle's jovial familiarity, Marlowe now must endure what he has feared all along, conversation with the fine lady. The first conversation goes exactly as one would imagine, with Marlowe too terrified to raise his eyes and actually look at Kate's face, and Kate trying to encourage him. It's like a really, really bad first date. After a pause, Marlowe finally summons up the strength to, gathering his courage, say, "I have been an observer upon life, madam, while others were enjoying it." Suggesting don't expect much from me. To which she then says, "Ah, but you have not been wholly an observer, I presume. The ladies, I should hope, have employed some part of your addresses." Marlowe, relapsing into timidity, "Pardon me, madam, I as you have studied, I've studied only to deserve them." "And that, some say, is the very worst way to obtain them." "Perhaps so, madam, but I love to converse only with the more grave and sensible part of the sex. But I'm afraid I grow tiresome." "Well, not at all, sir. There's nothing I like so much as grave conversation myself. I could hear it forever. Indeed, I have often been surprised how a man of sentiment could ever admire those light, airy pleasures where nothing reaches the heart." "It's a disease of the mind, madam. In the variety of taste there must be some who, wanting a relish for "I understand you, sir. There must be some who, wanting a relish for refined pleasures, pretend to despise what they are incapable of tasting." "My meaning, madam, but infinitely better expressed. I can't help observing—" In an aside, Kate says, "Who could ever suppose this fellow impotent on even some occasions?" I was going to observe, sir. I was observing, madam. I protest, madam, I forgot what I was going to observe." Kate, in another aside, "I vow so I do. You were observing, sir, that this age of hypocrisy—" "Something about hypocrisy, sir." Yes, madam, it was an age of hypocrisy. There are few upon a strict inquiry that do not, "I understand you perfectly, sir." "Gad, that's more than I do myself." Okay. Now, as Marlowe stammers nervously and incoherently, Kate sees his anxiety and tries to help him in every way to overcome it. She encourages him to be less formal and decorous. She claims she loves grave, serious talk in a man and tries to offer some. She reformulates Marlowe's half-baked thoughts that he's too nervous to express and then gives him credit for wit. Yet her poise and generosity and verbal cleverness only deepen Marlowe's insecurity and make him feel more inadequate, because the more she shines, the more he feels absolutely hopeless. Considering their differing responses then, after this painful conversation mercifully ends, Marlowe says to himself, "Well, this pretty smooth dialogue has done for me. I've blown it. I'm leaving." Meanwhile, to herself, in a soliloquy, Kate says, "Ha, ha, ha. Was there ever such a sober, sentimental interview? I'm certain he scarce looked in my face the whole time. Yet this fellow, but for his unaccountable bashfulness, is pretty well, too. He has a good sense, but then so buried in his fears that it fatigues one more than ignorance. If I could teach him a little confidence, it would be doing somebody that I know of a piece of service. But who is that somebody? That, faith, is a question I can scarce answer." Well, Marlowe is sure that his tongue-tied performance has removed any chance of Kate's liking him as a suitor. She's sure that he simply appeared ridiculous. But her reaction, expressed in the soliloquy, proves that she has by no means given up on him. She was, after all, warned about his hypermodesty both by her father and by Constance. Now, she's not sure that she can love him, but she is intrigued and determined to teach Marlowe confidence, if nothing else. But she then asks herself how to do this and for whom she is doing it. Indeed, her last question that she cannot answer, for whom would I be doing this service if I could teach this guy some confidence with woman? Well, the answer to the question then who she would be serving, I think, is one that the reader has to take up. She would possibly be doing it for her own benefit. If Marlowe proves teachable, certainly she would benefit because then he would be worthy of her love. But also for his benefit, certainly, because she sees that he is, at least with women like herself, socially absolutely backward and hopeless. It would be good for him. It might be good for her, but also it would be good for her father. She wants to please her father, to do a service to her father, who after all set up the meeting, and he too then would be the beneficiary of her instruction, which would make Marlowe more confident. There would seem to be a triple benefit here, though Kate has not yet formulated quite in those terms. Well, how do we account for the patience that Kate is showing here? Her willingness to give Marlowe a chance after he has behaved so preposterously. Well, clearly, as the soliloquy suggests, Kate sees something in him besides his paralyzing fear, something that she refers to as good sense, though that could be many different things. She sees something then of worthiness, and she continues then, even after Hardcastle later condemns Marlowe as a presumptuous ingrate. What she sees perhaps is a decency, and perhaps most of all in Marlowe, she perceives a capacity for improvement in him that Marlowe isn't even aware that he possesses himself. So throughout the first two acts of She Stoops to Conquer, we've seen how Goldsmith plays on binary contrasts, okay? Youth versus age, modernity versus tradition, country versus city, bad parenting versus good parenting, and in Marlowe, this bifurcated reaction to women of two different classes. But amid these contrasts, Goldsmith also establishes some ironic and improbable similarities between oppositional characters. As I noted earlier, Tony actually echoes Hardcastle's disdain for social pretensions, modern affectations of dress, and fine manners. And the two of them share a democratic disregard also for class boundaries in their friendships with members of the lower classes. In another ironic kinship, Marlowe echoes Tony's discomfort with fine ladies like Constance and Kate. And both these men, Marlowe and Tony, who are oppositional in other ways, prefer to consort with lower class women. As Tony tells Hastings, he certainly reflects Marlowe's own proclivities for tavern wenches when Hastings says, "You must allow that your cousin Constance has a little beauty." A little, to which Tony says, "Nah, she's a bandbox. She's all a made-up thing, man. You could but bet Bouncer of those parts, and then you might see her beauty. God, she's two eyes, bet Bouncer, black as sloes, and cheeks as broad and red as a pulpit cushion. She'd make two of your Constance, yes." Tavern wenches. They both like them. And we might note there is still yet another irony in which opposites seem to conjoin, in that Tony and Constance, who clearly cannot stand one another, are nonetheless united and come together in their shared resentment for Mrs. Hardcastle's matchmaking efforts and her attempt to control both of their inheritances. So these unexpected similarities in binary characters who are at odds with one another or dislike one another or who have competing interests against one another, the fact that they are alike in certain ways is yet another source of comic pleasure in this play. In this case, it's not dramatic irony, but rather what we might call circumstantial irony. Okay. Act 3 opens with Kate and her father comparing impressions of Marlowe, which highlights, of course, his contradictory behavior that is rooted in exaggerated class consciousness, particularly toward women. Miss Hardcastle observes that he met me first with a respectful bow, a stammering voice, and a look fixed on the ground, to which Hardcastle says, "Well, he met me with a loud voice, a lordly air, and a familiarity that made my blood freeze again. One of us," she says, "must certainly be mistaken," to which Hardcastle says, "If he be what he has shown himself to me, I'm determined he shall never have my consent to marry you," to which Kate then says, "And if he's the sullen thing I take him for, he shall never have mine." Well, what is he? Well, Marlowe's inconsistencies are most extreme, obviously, regarding women. That is, the two types of women that he conceives to exist. And for this prejudice, he'll clearly need to be embarrassed and punished later in the play if he is to be corrected and reformed in this narrow and misguided prejudice. But he'll also be rewarded for his capacity to see his moral error and to change through Kate's stratagem. But the reward will come only after the punishment, and the punishment is necessary for the psychological and moral clarification. So, while Goldsmith does satirize Marlowe's class snobbery and his fastidious preoccupation with appearances, this is also a play in which that satire is going to be much gentler than what we find in Molière. And Marlowe, who is going to be duped, and is being duped as we've seen, isn't the only comic dupe in the play. There's another one, Mrs. Hardcastle. Her crime isn't, like Marlowe's, snobbery per se, though she does aspire to a certain class climbing, but her primary crime is her greed and her manipulation, and both of those things go into perhaps her greatest crime of all, which is her terrible parenting as Tony's mother. She, like Marlowe, will need to be punished for these offenses, though, as we'll see, her capacity to learn from her punishment and to change as a consequence is considerably less than Marlowe's. Well, by the middle of the play, Tony and Constance and Hastings are all planning to deceive Mrs. Hardcastle. They're all plotting against her. And in doing so, they expose her avarice and her hypocrisy. How? Well, Tony tricks his mother into telling Constance that the gems, her inheritance, have been lost. And when Mrs. Hardcastle tells her niece of this, she urges Constance to resign herself to this loss, only then to go absolutely berserk when it turns out that they are gone. We, of course, know that Tony has stolen them. She doesn't. And that Tony has given them to Hastings. As she rails, having said that one should always somehow be calm in the face of loss and resign to it, as she rails at the loss of these gems that she wants to keep her hands on, Tony tortures his mother. Tony says, "The jewels are your own already. I've stolen them out of her bureau," he tells Constance. "All right. Thank you, dear cousin," she says. Well, when Mrs. Hardcastle finds that they are actually missing, she says, "Boy, I am ruined. My bureau's been broken open and they're taken away." Tony pretends as if this is in fact part of the game, that we're going to pretend that they've been stolen. Stick to that, mother. I'll bear witness, Call me to bear witness. I tell you, Tony, no, all that's precious, the jewels are gone. They're gone. By laws, Mom, you make me laugh so. Ha, 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 ha. You know who took on you. I know who took them well enough. Ha, 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 ha. Was there ever such a blockhead as you, she tells Tony, that can't tell the difference between jest and earnest? Tony again says, I can bear witness to that. You laugh, you unfeeling brute, as if you enjoyed my distress. Well, he clearly does. Indeed, he later describes her as going off like a Catherine wheel in all directions in her distress, flailing about. Zounds, how she fidgets and spits like a Catherine wheel, spinning off sparks of agitation and grievance at having found that the gems that she wanted Constance to believe had been stolen really are missing. Now, note that this is one of the play's funnier moments, but at this moment, or shortly hereafter, Kate's maid informs her that Tony misdirected Marlowe and Hastings, and that Marlowe has indeed mistaken her for a barmaid when he saw her briefly in a simple afternoon country attire at a distance. This information inspires Kate to formulate a plan for testing Marlowe's worthiness as a suitor by allowing him to imagine, to think, indeed, that she is a barmaid, by pretending, that is to say, that she really is the woman of humble birth that he takes her to be. But what does Kate hope to gain by this ruse? Well, in what may be the most intriguing passage in the play, here's how she explains what she hopes to gain. It's really several things. In the first place, I shall be seen, and that is no small advantage to a girl who brings her face to market. Then I shall perhaps make an acquaintance, and that's no small victory gained over one who never addresses any but by the wildest of her sex. But my chief aim is to take my gentleman off his guard, and like an invisible champion of romance, examine the giant's force before I offer to combat. Now, in this intriguing passage, we learn much about Kate. First, she hopes that by pretending to be a barmaid, she can, in the end, she can attract Marlowe's gaze, that he will now actually look at her as he did not when he met her when she was dressed as her elegant self, and by looking at her, that he will be physically attracted to her beauty. Okay, that will accomplish something right there. Second, another thing she hopes to accomplish is that when Marlowe feels relaxed in her presence in this lower class guise of what he takes to be a tavern maid, he will reveal other sides of himself so that her impersonation of a tavern maid will allow her to get to know him, to see him more fully. And finally, the most important thing that Kate says she wants from this opportunity is to see Marlowe when he is, quote, off his guard. That is to say, no longer timorous, no longer fearful, so that she can then, quote, examine his, quote, force. What does she mean by Marlowe's force? I think she means his maleness, or the nature of his maleness. How much of this force, this masculinity, is a product of the patriarchal values that he has absorbed in London society among his peer group, and how much of it is intrinsic? To put it another way, how much of what he presents as his masculinity is a pose, and how much of it is an authentic representation of the man himself? Now, if it is intrinsic, if his bad behavior is somehow deeply rooted within him rather than being a pose that he has acquired in London, then it would be more difficult to extirpate. On the other hand, if it is somehow inauthentic, then it can be corrected. But what does she mean when she speaks of offering combat here? Like an invisible champion of romance, I offer combat. Note that it is now Kate, not Marlowe, who describes courtship in the language of a military campaign, in the language of war and battle. She must combat Marlowe's distrust of fine ladies, and she must distrust what she knows now are his narrow class prejudices, or at least she's heard about. So in order to conquer Marlowe then, to invoke that key word in the play's title, in order to conquer Marlowe in this figurative warfare, Kate must then do two things. She must first, as she has already suggested, help Marlowe overcome his fears and his class-bound limitations. And at the same time, conquering means that she must make him love her for herself rather than for some narrow or misguided idea in his mind of what she represents. Okay. To help him overcome his limitations and prejudices and fears, and to conquer him in that she will make him love her for what she is. Well, paradoxically, in order to raise Marlowe to the status of being a worthy mate, Kate then must stoop socially to the role of a tavern maid and stoop behaviorally to the active pretense of deceiving Marlowe by allowing him to go on thinking that that's what she is. And so, also paradoxically, in order to get at the truth of Marlowe's character, in order to determine who he really is as a man, and in order to get Marlowe to see the truth of who she is, Kate must, again, exploit deception. Well, the idea then of deception getting at truth is at the root of the entire performance here. Kate puts her plan into action so that her father can witness it at her second meeting with Marlowe. Here, mistaking her for this servant within the inn, he tries to seduce her in a sleazy, practiced way that has obviously succeeded with other real barmaids in the past, and so he naturally assumes this one will fall for her. Looking her full in the face, he says, "Yes, child, I think I did call for you. I vowed, child. You are vastly handsome." Yes. Well, a little bit as she attempts to fend him off, Marlowe says, "To guess at this distance, you can't be much more than 40. Approaching, yet nearer, I don't think quite so much. Approaching still more. By coming closer to some women, they look younger, but when they come very close indeed, attempting to kiss her, keep your distance. This doesn't stop him. "I protest, child, you use me extremely ill. If you keep me at a distance, how is it possible you and I can ever become acquainted?" To which then Kate says, "And who wants to become acquainted with you? I want no such acquaintance, not I. I'm sure you did not treat Miss Hardcastle that was here a while ago with this obstreperous manner. I'll warrant me before her you looked dashed and kept bowing your head and talked for all the world as if you were before a justice of the peace." Marlowe aside, "Egad, she hit it, she's sure. In awe of her child. Mere awkward squinting. No, I find you don't know me." I laughed, railed at her a little bit, was unwilling to be too severe with her. No, I could never be too severe. Curse me. To which Kate says, "Oh, then, sir, you are a favorite, I find, among the ladies." "Yes, my dear, I've always been a favorite." Now, you'll note that while Kate is evading this cliche-ridden "come on" from Marlowe, her response is to try to force Marlowe to consider the double standard in his treatment of women. She reminds him of how he had behaved when he had seen Kate Hardcastle earlier and how he was bashful and couldn't even look at her, even though he claims he was suave. Kate is, in short, giving him a chance here to admit his unfairness to her as barmaid, and the double standard of behavior. And by admitting it, she's giving him a chance to atone for that egregious inconsistency. In an important aside, Marlowe says, "She looks knowing, methinks." Yeah, knowing. In what sense? Marlowe realizes and says to himself twice that this woman is seeing through him, knowing me. Not just knowing in that she sees that his conduct with women is completely inconsistent and contradictory, but knowing in another sense. He knows that she knows that what he is engaged in as he tries to seduce the barmaid is a performance. It is not real self-confidence. It is not a natural expression of his personality. Rather, it is a pose. It's a practiced act. It's a routine that he's picked up in London. Kate realizes then that both of the Marlowes that she has seen are essentially unnatural. The one is made unnatural by exaggerated fear, and the other is made unnatural by role-playing in this series of lines. "Let me come a little closer to see how old you are so that I can kiss you. Oh, my child, you are vastly handsome. Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" All of this. In short, both sides of Marlowe are not natural expressions of who he is. They're both artificial. Marlowe feels a moment of insecurity at being exposed this way, but instead of reflecting on that, he doubles down and reverts again to his ridiculous performance as a seducer. Immediately after, he says, "She's knowing me," thinks, "Oh." Suddenly then he decides, "Then you must show me your embroidery. I embroider and draw patterns myself a little. If you want to judge of your work, you must apply to me," seizing her hand. She struggles against it. "And why not, my angel? Such beauty fires before the power of resistance. Pshaw. Oh, here comes the father." And he lets her go. Well, you'll note that as if to convince himself of his machismo, he tries to deny what he recognizes she has seen in him, exposed him. But then afterward, he goes to his friend Hastings and brags about it, distorting what really occurred and leaving out what she has exposed about him. Marlowe says, "Mine, you rogue, yes, that tavern maid. Such fire, such motion, such eyes, such lips. But egad, she would not let me kiss them, though. But you are sure, so very sure of her? Why, man, she talked of showing me her work above stairs. Am I not to improve the pattern? But how can you, Charles, go and rob a woman of her honor like that? Pshaw, pshaw, we all know the honor of the barmaid of an inn. I didn't intend to rob her. Take my word for it, there's nothing in this house I shan't honestly pay for. I believe the girl has virtue. And if she has her, she'd be the last man in the world who would ever attempt to corrupt it." Now, note that we see here Marlowe's misogynistic view of the lower classes, women in particular, at its most troubling. In his London circle, Marlowe has acquired the idea that any woman of the working classes, any tavern maid, is probably a slut, and that therefore they have no honor to steal by seducing them. It would not be stealing anything because it doesn't exist. She's not a virgin, he assumes. Yet, he has just witnessed in his conversation that the woman in question whom he was speaking to does have virtue. He lied about her inviting him to look at her embroidery. She, in fact, resisted it. He knows that. He knows she's virtuous. And so when Hastings reminds him, I believe that woman is virtuous, Marlowe is forced to concede. Yes, well, in that case, I would never attempt to corrupt a woman if she had real virtue. His entire pose suddenly falls apart. Kate has challenged Marlowe's assumption. She has destabilized his simplistic attitudes and prejudices toward class and gender. In short, he's already confused, even when he talks to Hastings here, and by fabricating the scene, he's trying to regain some sense of artificial confidence. But Marlowe's confusion is necessary. It is the precondition for a change in his attitude. And therefore, it's important that he backs down when Hastings says, I believe the woman has virtue. And he says, well, I would never do anything then to corrupt it. Hardcastle had witnessed Marlowe's attempted seduction of Kate from a distance just before he came in. And he tells her now that it confirms his own view of Marlowe, this figure who he just saw trying to embrace his daughter. But Kate asks her father to allow her to convince him that this was no more the real Marlowe than that paralyzed, hyper-modest fellow that she had seen earlier in the day. And again, it's clear from the start that she saw and still sees potential in him, something that can be brought out, a virtue indwelling. She says, "But if I shortly convince you of his modesty, that he has only faults that will pass with time, and the virtues that will improve with age, I hope you'll forgive him." Well, it is a mark of the mutual trust and love that Kate and Hardcastle have for one another that Hardcastle is willing to give Marlowe another chance, despite the insults he's received from him. And it is a mark of Kate's love and confidence in her father that, knowing that he has been insulted, she still believes that she can convince him, that he'll be open-minded and fair-minded enough to accept this man, Marlowe, the man who first he chose for her, and that now she has chosen herself. Before he had hoped that she would accept his choice, now Kate wants her father to accept Marlowe as her choice. We'll pick up there next time, and we will also then move on to the first act of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. See you then.